In December 1926, Emperor Taisho passed away, and his eldest son, the 25-year-old Crown Prince Hirohito, ascended the throne as the 124th emperor. Thus, the Showa era began. In Manchuria, following Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, the South Manchuria Railway Company was founded as a semi-government enterprise. The company not only ran the railway, but also managed the politics and infrastructure of the surrounding towns and cities, while operating mines and steelworks. In Port Arthur, the Kwantung Governor-General's office was set up, and its military arm, the Kwantung Army, was tasked with guarding the railway. Over the course of 2 decades, the population of Manchuria swelled from around 15 million to 30 million. With an influx of Japanese settlers, Koreans, and refugees fleeing turmoil in late Qing China. In the Republic of China, no unified government held sway, and regional warlords continued to fight each other. When Yuan Shikai died in June 1916, Sun Yat-sen, who had lost his position to Yuan and had been in exile in Japan, returned to establish the Kuomintang, once again seeking to reunify China. At this point, Sun forged a cooperative relationship with the Soviet-backed Chinese Communist Party. After Sun's death in March 1925, Chiang Kai-shek carried on his legacy, launching the Northern Expedition from the south in July 1926. Meanwhile, Zhang Zuolin, who had gained control of the Beijing government, effectively ruled Manchuria. As the Kuomintang advanced, eliminating or absorbing local warlords, the Communists expanded their support base and even sought to spread their ideology within the Kuomintang itself. Alarmed, Chiang eventually moved to purge the Communists after March 1927, when some Communist soldiers staged attacks on foreign consulates and residents in Shanghai, including Japanese. This marked the outbreak of civil war between the Kuomintang and the Communists. Britain and the United States retaliated with shelling, but Japan's Foreign Minister Kujuro Shidehara pursued a conciliatory line and even issued a misleading report downplaying the incident. The Kuomintang pressed ahead, and after occupying Beijing in June 1928, declared the reunification of the Republic of China. On his way back to Manchuria, Zhang Zuolin was killed when his train was blown up. Many believed the Kwantung Army was behind it, though the true culprits were never identified. Since Zhang had connections with both Japan and the Soviets, at times serving as a double agent, some argue Soviet involvement was likely. Prime Minister Tanaka Giichi vowed to track down and punish the perpetrators, but the army and cabinet kept revising their reports in a way that seemed to shield the military. Emperor Showa, furious at this evasiveness, rebuked them sharply. Deeply shaken, Tanaka resigned, and 3 months later he died of angina. The emperor, regretting the impact his words had caused, resolved thereafter not to interfere personally in cabinet decisions. In October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed, bringing down countless companies and banks. The shock spread worldwide, plunging the global economy into depression. Japan, heavily reliant on exports to the United States, was hit hard as many firms collapsed. Matters worsened in 1930, when an abundant harvest caused farm prices to plummet, slashing farmers' incomes. The following year, a devastating cold snap led to widespread crop failure. The Japanese government sought relief by boosting exports to India and Southeast Asia. This brought temporary recovery, but cheap Japanese goods were condemned by Western powers as social dumping. Soon, the major powers turned to protectionist bloc economies. Japan, lacking resources and excluded from these economic blocs, turned its eyes toward further development of Manchuria. Likewise, Germany, also left outside, sought expansion into Eastern Europe, while Italy turned to North Africa. Meanwhile, the London Naval Conference of 1930 decided to cap Japan's auxiliary fleet at about 70% of the U.S. Navy's size. Some military officers and opposition politicians fiercely attacked this as a violation of the Emperor's supreme command authority. This controversy spread to the public, inflaming anti-government sentiment. In the midst of the uproar, Prime Minister Hamaguchi Osachi was shot and critically wounded by a right-wing extremist. He later resigned and died 9 months afterward. From then on, cabinets became increasingly reluctant to confront the military. Traditionally, army officers were barred from politics under the emperor's edicts, and they had no voting rights. Yet among army officers who feared the rise of party politicians lacking military knowledge, groups were formed to debate policy. Jiang Shuiliang, the son of Jiang Zuolin, who had remained in Beijing, reconciled with Chiang Kai-shek in September 1929 and joined the Kuomintang government. After that, he sought to reclaim control over Manchuria by imposing additional taxes on Japanese settlers and confiscating land from Japanese colonists. He also stirred up anti-Japanese movements, which led to repeated killings and violent incidents. Even when Japanese victims appealed to their consulates, their complaints were ignored, and the foreign minister even decided to withdraw Japanese auxiliary police units. Under such conditions, the settlers increasingly looked to the Kwantung Army for protection. In this climate, Colonel Ishiwara Kanji, the Kwantung Army's chief of operations, devised a plan to break the deadlock. The Kwantung Army had long believed that Japan needed to control all of Manchuria in anticipation of an eventual Soviet advance to the south. Since Lenin's death in 1924 had left the Soviet Union in political turmoil, they judged that now was the best chance to seize northern Manchuria. In September 1931, under the strategy devised by Ishiwara Kanji, known as a genius of military planning, the Kwantung Army staged a self-orchestrated bombing on a section of the South Manchurian Railway. Blaming the incident on sabotage by Jiang Shuiliang's forces, they launched a military campaign. With just 10,000 men, the Kwantung Army engaged 230,000 Kuomintang troops, and within 5 months had brought all of Manchuria under military control. Because many locals had already been hostile to Jiang's regime, there was little resistance from Manchuria's 30 million residents. Moreover, Chiang Kai-shek, prioritizing his struggle against the communists, chose at this stage to tolerate Japan's occupation of Manchuria. In March 1932, the Kwantung Army established a new state called Manchukuo. They placed the last Qing emperor, Puyi, on the throne as its nominal head, presenting the regime as an independent nation. In reality, it was a puppet state under Japanese authority. Since this series of plans had been carried out without consulting the Japanese government, Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi opposed recognizing the new state. But in May, he was assassinated in a terrorist attack led mainly by naval officers dissatisfied with the naval disarmament treaties. On that day, a welcome party for Charlie Chaplin was scheduled at the Prime Minister's residence. The officers even planned to assassinate Chaplin, whom they regarded as a symbol of corrupt Western culture, but the party was cancelled at the last moment, and Chaplin escaped unharmed. The succeeding cabinet of Saito Makoto recognized Manchukuo and began promoting a national policy of sending agricultural settlers there. Just before Manchukuo was established, the League of Nations had dispatched the Lytton Commission in February 1932 to investigate the Manchurian railway explosion. Its report admitted that Japan had legitimate interests in Manchuria and that Chinese authorities had systematically endangered Japanese residents. Yet it refused to recognize the new state and instead proposed that Japan withdraw its forces while League organs would maintain order in the region. Japan rejected the proposal. At home, there was no willingness to relinquish Manchuria, and there was also resentment at being criticized by Western powers that themselves had long expanded through colonial conquests. In 1933, Japan formally withdrew from the League of Nations, and at the same time, the naval disarmament treaties lapsed. Since the assassination of Prime Minister Hamaguchi in 1930, political terrorism had continued to escalate. In February 1936, a group of army officers belonging to the so-called Kodoha, Imperial Way faction, staged a coup with about 1,400 soldiers. They attacked the Prime Minister's residence, the Metropolitan Police headquarters, and other key sites, assassinating Finance Minister Takahashi Korekiyo and Home Minister Saito Makoto while occupying the center of Tokyo. The Kodoha's goal was to sweep away what they saw as corrupt politicians and zaibatsu, establish a military regime, and build a socialist-style state under the emperor's direct rule by any means necessary. When the chief aide-de-camp, who had been sympathetic to the Kodoha, asked Emperor Showa to at least understand their feelings, the emperor flew into a rage and ordered the coup suppressed. The rebellion was crushed and its leaders executed. Yet the climate of fear meant that politicians no longer dared criticize the military, lest they become targets of terrorism themselves. Afterward, the rival Toseiha, control faction, gained dominance in the army. They emphasized centralized control and built a system in which the military increasingly dictated politics, enforcing totalitarian policies such as restrictions on free speech. Amid this climate, Ozaki Hotsumi, a former journalist, was hired as a special advisor close to Prime Minister Konoe and came to exert great influence over national politics. He later turned out to be a communist spy. At the same time, dictators were rising in Europe: Stalin in the Soviet Union, Hitler in Germany, and Mussolini in Italy, surrounded by anti-communist states. Germany, the Republic of China, Manchukuo, and Japan, Stalin of the Soviet Union, at the Seventh Comintern Congress in July 1935, called on communist leaders worldwide to suspend global revolution for the time being and instead to pursue popular fronts, broad alliances of all forces opposed to fascism. In response, Japan and Germany, with the dual aim of defending against communism and avoiding international isolation after withdrawing from the League of Nations, Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in November 1936. Germany had, since 1933, also been supporting China by sending military advisors and weapons. In 1936, General Alexander von Falkenhausen pressed Cheng to confront Japan before Britain and America were pulled into a European war. By October, he was even proposing a surprise attack. Chiang, however, rejected these ideas and continued to advocate Sino-Japanese friendship. In December, however, Chiang was seized and held captive by Zhang Xueliang in what became the Xi'an Incident. While detained, Chiang agreed to end the civil war between Kuomintang and communists. Though details of the negotiations remain unclear, it's known that Mao Zedong had earlier demanded a halt to the civil war and a united front against Japan. Chiang had rejected it, but Zhang, driven by strong anti-Japanese feelings, sided with the communists. Japan had stationed troops in Beijing since the Boxer Rebellion, under rights granted by the Boxer Protocol. On July 7, 1937, during night maneuvers near the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing, Japanese forces came under fire. They returned fire, claiming the first shots had come from Chinese troops, while the Chinese insisted they were only responding after being fired upon. Some evidence suggests communist forces may have deliberately fired at both sides to spark conflict. At first, this was a limited clash. Ishiwara Kanji, now head of the Army General Staff's Operations Section and architect of the Manchurian Incident, opposed escalation. His original plan had been aimed at countering the Soviet Union, not China. But the Kwantung Army, emboldened by a string of victories, demanded retaliation and skirmishes spread. On July 27th, they bombed Chinese troops who remained in Tongzhou, Beijing, despite the city being designated a demilitarized zone. In Beijing, there existed the East Hebei Anti-Communist Autonomous Government, often described as a Japanese puppet regime. The Kwantung Army mistakenly bombed a security forces training center. The following day, the Kwantung Army issued an apology and offered compensation to the families of the dead and the wounded. But on July 29th, enraged by the mistaken bombing, Chinese security forces of the East Hebei regime turned on the Japanese settlement, attacking it with brutal methods so horrific that details are scarcely told, massacring more than 200 Japanese and Koreans. News of the massacre provoked outrage across Japan, sharply inflaming anti-Chinese sentiment. The Toseiha faction, which held sway within the army, seized on the incident to press for greater military expansion. The East Hebei government itself later issued an apology and paid compensation, and for the time being the matter was closed. However, it was only later, through the memoirs of Zhang Qingyu, the commander responsible, that it became clear the uprising had been planned in advance. Even as Ishiwara continued to argue desperately against further expansion within army headquarters, incidents of sniper fire and deliberate provocations by Chinese forces were already flaring up in Shanghai. On August 9th, a Japanese naval lieutenant and a seaman were killed during a reconnaissance mission. This turned the Navy, until then reluctant, toward a hardline stance. Warships were dispatched to Shanghai, and the army was asked to send reinforcements. Ishiwara again warned that deploying the army would mean full-scale war, but reports soon came in of large Chinese troop movements toward Shanghai. The General Staff reluctantly approved sending ground forces. On August 16th, the cruiser Izumo was bombed while anchored off Shanghai. Japanese forces retaliated, and as Chinese troops retreated, fighting expanded all the way to Beijing. In North China, Kwantung Army Chief of Staff Tojo Hideki pressed for further operations, and soon the front extended as far as Nanjing. And by October, Japanese forces had taken most of the city. Meanwhile, on August 21st, China signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, securing supplies of Soviet aircraft, rifles, and artillery. Chiang Kai-shek also sought communist cooperation, and on September 23rd, the Second United Front of Nationalists and Communists was formed. This, in turn, encouraged Italy to join Japan and Germany, the Anti-Comintern Pact. In November 1937, German Ambassador Oskar Trautmann mediated peace talks between Japan and China. Many in the Japanese army favored peace, but after Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital of Nanjing in December, the government grew overconfident and presented harsher conditions. When Chiang refused, Japan broke off negotiations in January 1938. The Kuomintang government retreated to Chongqing, prolonging the war. What began as a local clash had now become a full-scale conflict, trapping Japan in the very quagmire Ishiwara had foreseen. Because neither side issued a formal declaration of war, the conflict was officially called the China Incident, rather than the Sino-Japanese War,